știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. самых окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Над страной весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
что рабочий и сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы извинить, и что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем твою своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. In der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Reitet ein in der Arbeiter Einheitsfront.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 2nd of August 2025, and here we are tonight with another discussion based on popular internet misapprehensions, I think the best way of putting that is. And that is the question of whether the West is undergoing a controlled demolition. And this is the common explanation for the decline of the Anglo-American, but also Western European imperial powers that's put out there by some on, shall we say, multipolar fraudsters, and it relates to the fact that, of course, the West appears to be in decline, and very much is in decline compared to what it was, and this is proffered as an explanation as to why. Now, before we begin, I want to make a distinction in terms of what we're talking about tonight. When we're talking about the West being under controlled demolition, and this is in response to something that G. Carroll said on the Telegram chat earlier with regard to a country like Romania, I'm drawing a line between the imperialist powers and those who are semi-colonies and neo-colonies of the imperialist powers. When it comes to those countries, yes, the question of whether the imperialist powers are carrying out a controlled demolition is a different one, because in many respects they are. So if you look at, like, especially the former socialist countries in the center and east of Europe, so East Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, all the countries of the former Yugoslavia. All of those countries did go through a controlled demolition of their industrial base all the way through the 90s and into the 2000s. So when it comes to countries that have been nearly subjugated, and the Germans principally, with the Americans and the British and the French in tow as well, but the German imperialism is principally responsible for this, have pushed deindustrialization and the creation of very weak, pliable regimes that will basically turn their countries into sources of labor, and maybe for sources of production for like one resource or another. And the industrial base that a place like socialist Romania did have back in the Ceausescu period, even up to 1989, was deliberately destroyed to render these countries into semi-colonies and neo-colonies. And in a place like Romania, that is definitely a case of the country being reduced to the status of a neo-colony, according to the definition given to us by Kwame Nkrumah. And it is, I would emphasize, German imperialism in the lead, but do not neglect the role of US, British, and French imperialism in doing so. And I say German imperialism because it is German imperialism that is the principal power behind the European Union. You can argue that, of course, German imperialism has a back and forth dynamic, to say the least, with US imperialism, and the US imperialism is the overarching power. But German imperialism very much does its own dirty work, often via the EU. But the EU very much is a German-dominated institution. So clear that up first. We're not talking tonight about the neo-colonies, because it is true that for them, their economies are either deliberately destroyed if they were ever capable of sustaining an independent industrial base, or deliberately afflicted with severe economic retardation. Meaning, if you look at like what the French did in the Sahel, so Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, etc., there, when they established these as neo-colonies, they very much did deliberately degrade their economic development to keep them as dependencies of France, and also to have them just as being sites of raw resource extraction that could be used to fuel the industrial base of France. That's something that is and what has been happening until recently, thankfully, in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, Chad a little bit as well. The French are losing ground, and we can only hope that many more countries follow in their path. So tonight we're going to talk about the West. We're going to talk about the Anglo-American imperialists, and of course the other imperial powers, France, Germany, etc., in terms of what is happening to them at the moment. So thanks to all 229 of you watching at the moment. Be sure to like and share this stream, and to spread the good word around, shall we say. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the decline of the West? What we're talking about is and this is something which obsesses many YouTube channels at the moment. What we're talking about is the relative decline in the market share of the West in terms of their export markets, because it used to be the imperial powers used to seek to dominate the markets of the oppressed nations, to force them to buy products produced in the imperial core. That's something that British imperialism used to do. That was what its protected sterling area was all about. Is about forcing countries within it to purchase only off them, and this eventually was eroded and destroyed. And what's happened, particularly with Britain and the United States, but Britain being the oldest imperialist power, it applies to them the most, has gone from a situation where they are exporting goods to exporting capital, a trajectory of capitalism that was predicted as early on as like the 1860s by Marx and Engels, and which Lenin theorized about and demonstrated in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. The move to imperialism is it's simultaneously the highest point that capitalism reaches in terms of its ability to dominate whole areas of the world, and to extract profit at a massive rate from many areas of the world. But at the same time, it is the point where things decisively go on the slide. And they go on the slide because the bourgeoisie stops reinvesting in the home nation and simply goes to exporting capital all over the place, because that generates profit far quicker than long-term investment in an industrial base, particularly when the rate of profit starts to dip, particularly when they find that actually employment of proletarians in other countries who are employed on far less wages actually makes more profit than it would do to have a very heavily automated factory in the imperial core nations. It makes more profit if you actually have more workers working on older forms of means of production, producing things like textiles, etc., which is what happens in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, etc. You end up with capitalists using much older machinery and greater amount of labor, and actually generating more profits as a result. This is one of the paradoxes of capitalist development in the imperialist period. So let's go back to the talk of decline. The decline of the West is baked into imperialism. This is, and of course, if we're talking about the decline of a system, capitalism has built into its very foundations a chronic and massive instability, which of course it will demonstrate every, 7 to 10 years, roughly from the 1820s onwards, as Marx observed, where capitalism produces goods to the point where there comes to be a glut of commodities, where capitalism can no longer sell all the commodities that they have produced, where in order to restore profitability, large amounts of commodities, large amounts of capital, large amounts of means of production itself have to be destroyed and the system purged in order to start the process all over again. That is inherent. The crisis of overproduction is inherent to capitalism from its earliest period, and that needs to be understood. So even when Britain was the dominant industrial power in the world, it still had very much within it the capacity to destroy itself, to eliminate large amounts of capital, large amounts of commodities, and even large amounts of labor and before profitability could be restored. You see, if you overproduce on commodities or overproduce on capital, you then have to liquidate that. To go back to a quote I'm very fond of from Andrew Mellon, former US Treasury Secretary and one of the richest men in the country in the 1920s, which is you have to liquidate labor, liquidate capital, liquidate farms, etc., until you get to the point of where it's profitable to produce things again. And that's the tremendous paradox of capitalism. It's one of the most tremendous contradictions. It has the capacity to produce gigantic amounts of commodities. It has the capacity to revolutionize the means of production. It has the capacity to overturn or upturn centuries of societal traditions, destroy whole ancient societies and countries. And at the same time, it has the capacity to destroy itself. This is built into the system. So when we're talking about the decline of the West, you have the fact that you have these cyclical crises of overproduction anyway. You then have the long-term decline of imperialism, meaning you have deindustrialization, you have the outsourcing of manufacturing to the less developed nations. You have then still, even with that outsourcing, you still have the cyclical crises of overproduction, because you have within the imperial core countries what is supposed to be a growing consumer base, but one which is on ever greater restrictions of wages, and which can't buy all of the consumer products that are dumped into that market. So this is another case where the imperialists try to get themselves out of a crisis by a crisis of profitability by outsourcing production to other nations where workers can be employed more cheaply and more profitably. So you then transform the economy of the imperial core nation. The economies of the imperial core nations go from being dominated by, or should we say, based upon heavy industry, to being based upon services. And that, of course, there is still some manufacturing that goes on inside the imperial core nations, but less and less as time goes on. But instead, you have then a largely service sector employed proletariat, which still needs to buy a significant amount of goods in order to make the profits for the companies that produce these things, and also on a lower level to maintain the illusion that that the proletariat can work in service jobs and have access to this sort of semi-bourgeois type life that was sold as the natural product of the development of capitalism away from the industrial model towards the post-industrial, but not really, and consumer-driven model. And so you need an active consumer base to be part of that. The problem that the capitalists then found was that more and more of the working class, due to severe restrictions on wages, couldn't actually afford to buy anything. So what do? Then you extend credit. You then extend credit when it comes to homes and the purchases of homes. You extend credit when it comes to the purchases of commodities. And you hope then that will paper over the cracks for a few more years, which is what has been done in Britain and the United States. See, what we see from the period where we enter into what I would call the intensification, or like the end stage of deindustrialization, is that the capitalist classes in the United States and Britain in particular, which is the two countries I'm going to focus on, you can also apply it to France too, move more and more to a position where the mass production of commodities is outsourced, where the remaining industrial capacity that is kept in the imperial core nations is specialist stuff that mainly focuses on like very high levels of technology, which is, again, to reiterate a point, what the purpose of China was meant to be, and now India. What the purpose of China was meant to be was to be a permanent source of cheap labor, to produce commodities for the imperial core nations' home markets, whilst at the same time, China wasn't meant to make technological innovations. Technological innovation was meant to be a permanent inbuilt advantage, like high-tech production was meant to be exclusively available to the imperial core countries. And the Chinese, the Indians and others, but especially the Chinese, weren't meant to be able to access this. So hence why the panic when the Chinese started to make serious technological innovations, because they were smart enough to insist on the sharing of technologies when they went into partnership with a Western corporation. But to go back to the question of decline, so you have decline of industry, outsourcing of industry, the change over to a service sector, largely service sector employment model, the stagnation of wages is papered over by those cracks are papered over in the 90s and the 2000s by extension of credit. Crisis of 2008, which is related to a massive crisis of overproduction, including an overproduction of capital. You then get a crisis of credit, and you also have then a crisis of profitability, and the bourgeoisie consistently refusing to invest. And that again creates a problem, because at each stage the ruling class in Britain has attempted to get away from the end result, the results of the crisis they've created, by essentially trying to, on the one level, pass on the costs of the working class, but also to continue to create just as many divisions in the working class as they can, in order to ensure that the working class doesn't unite against them, by maintaining different sections of the working class that still do just about well enough out of the British imperialist system, so that there won't be a domestic revolt. That's one of their chief concerns. They're running out of space to do that in now. So the crisis of the West is rooted in imperialism, which again, dialectically speaking, like is that you move to imperialism under the capitalist system in the classic period of imperialism, when you reach a point of industrial dominance, which at the same time it becomes a crisis. Britain reaches a point of absolute industrial dominance by like the late 1840s, but by the early 1850s, the British bourgeois has already started to look at exporting capital right elsewhere in the empire, rather than reinvesting in new means of production. Investment in new means of production is something which is the bourgeoisie becomes not very fond of it after a while, because you don't see an immediate return. Export of capital, to use Marx's terminology from Capital Volume 2, moving from the equation of money, commodity to money, to just money. The money to money profitability, that equation generates profits much quicker than money, commodity, money. Because if you're producing that middle bit, that commodity, to produce that consistently and profitably takes continued innovation in means of production. You also then run into the problem of the declining rate of profit, which is that as the level of technology improves and the amount of human labor in a commodity declines, the actual rate of profit sinks, which again is a problem. And it's part of the reason why the bourgeoisie has this very conflicted attitude when it comes to technological innovations. It's why you get like bourgeois trends, like primitivism being promoted. Like Rajani Palm Dutt points this out in his book on fascism in the 1930s. They got to the point where, in theory, as Palm Dutt argues, the level of technological innovation in means of production by the middle 1930s meant that under a fully planned system, there was the capacity to like cut the working week for workers in like the advanced capitalist nations in half. But of course, the bourgeoisie has no real interest in doing that. So hence why you end up with like continual crises. Like in technological innovation ends up producing more crises because capitalists reach a level of technological innovation in the means of production, which, whilst really efficient, actually produces greater and greater crises as the rate of profit shrinks. And so you get things like the bourgeoisie desperately trying to re-establish profitability via fascism. This is one of Palm Dut's arguments. But to go back to our current situation is similar in that this is why you have bourgeois arguments for like primitivism. It's because of it's rooted in the crisis of technological innovation that exists under capitalism, that you have the capacity is there to create like almost fully automated factories. The technological capacity is there to like have workers only work like a 10-hour week or something, or like say a 15-hour week, and spend the rest of the time, as the old formula from August Bebel once said, of engaging in leisure pursuits, engaging in other forms of work, artistic creations, or, and this is most crucial, learning how to participate in the governance of society. You can do all that when you reach a level of innovation that allows the working class to be only deployed to the factory, say 10 hours a week, which again, we're reaching the point where that could be possible. Capitalism, though, for the reasons I've been outlining, can't fully utilize that. For the same reason, they can't just switch over to a production fully done by robots and eliminate human labor entirely, because that would eliminate profit entirely. It'd also eliminate your consumer base. You wouldn't be able to do anything. See, this is the reasons why we're seeing the West decay is related to all of this. They can't use the level of innovation that they're capable of generating these days. They can't use properly the level of science and technology that's been created even in the Western world, never mind China. And so they're stuck. They're stuck using technology in the way that they've always tried to use it, and did successfully use it for quite some time, which is, as Marx outlines in Value, Price and Profit, the capitalists are forced to innovate when, and this is one of the ways they're forced to innovate, when workers get organized and go on strike and do it effectively. Suddenly the capitalists will jump forward with their innovations because they want to find labor saving devices, and they will find a labor saving device that essentially removes the old job done by the skilled worker and replaces it with a button pushing job or a switch flicking job done by a group of less skilled workers. This is the pattern you see in the British mills in the 19th century. Waves of strikes followed by a wave of new innovations in means of production that are specifically designed to cut down on the amount of skilled labor that's required, and therefore eliminate a potentially industrially powerful group of workers. This is how innovation is used under capitalism. So if you've got a bunch of, so we say, truckers or delivery drivers kicking off in the United States, well, what will the response of the capitalists be? Well, we're going to throw everything we can at automated self-driving cars. Now, I still think the technology for that is still very much in the earliest stages, but that's where the way that they're going to go. And what they're going to do is they're going to end up with basically they're going to try and end up replacing delivery drivers with essentially like computer operators sat at a remote station somewhere, monitoring the different vehicles that drive around and keeping an eye on them and making sure the machine's going to the right place. You might even end up with a human sat in the cab who has to jump out and deliver the package or something, but they'll be paid lower than a truck driver or a delivery driver. This is the way innovation works under capitalism. Human labor isn't done away with, it's just de-skilled, demoralized, and underpaid. And that is, again, that is how innovation is used. This is a key part of the reason why the West is declining. It can't utilize technology to cut down on the working week. They keep talking about it. They've been talking about it since the 60s, but in actual fact, in Britain now, people work longer and longer hours because the capitalists can't use technology to actually cut down on the working week to enable the working class to have greater time to study and participate in the running of society, because that's not what capitalism is all about. The point is that we reached a long time ago the point where the worker could be released for a significant portion of the week to do things like, again, play their part as being the rulers and the masters of society. And capital can't do that. So it just ends up stuck in these increasingly severe cyclical crises, and now a severe depression. It's why you get now in Britain and in the United States a move towards things like special economic zones, because the problem they're facing is one that is insoluble. They can't they can't innovate their way out of it. So what they're looking to do is to find areas in the country which can be basically reduced to the same level of wages and wages and exploitation that you would find in a neo-colony. That's ultimately the aim. They're proceeding slowly about it in this country, but that's where the things are going to end up, because they can't use the level of technology they have available for them. So what they're going to try and do is restore profitability by essentially restoring a regime of terror to be held over the head of the worker. That's what they want to do. And that is the way that the imperialist countries are all proceeding. See, France now loses access to the ability to hyper-exploit the labor of workers in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. And so the French factories go into crisis and start collapsing. What will the response of the French bourgeois be? Well, first of all, they'll probably try all kinds of coups to get rid of the governments in the Sahel. If they can't do that and they can't do anything else, then they will turn upon the domestic working class and try to reduce them down to the level of exploitation that can be found in the neo-colonial world. This is the nature of the crisis. The nature of the crisis is you have an irresolvable series of contradictions within the imperialist systems related to profitability, related to their inability to effectively use high technology, related to their inability to actually develop an industrial or redevelop an industrial base in the imperial core without reducing the working class there to the status of near slaves. These are all the contradictions that are piling up. Add into that the fact that they were only able to sustain themselves from the 60s until today by finding new sources of labor to hyper-exploit in the underdeveloped neo-colonial world. And now you have a situation where you have the Chinese developing other nations' means of production and offering much better deals than that which the imperialists are offering, or indeed can offer. And so this is a big part of the reason why there's so much hysterical anti-China stuff going on, because Chinese are actually helping to develop industrial bases in various different African countries. And again, bourgeois scholars were observing this until quite recently, that this was how the Chinese did business. They actually developed industrial bases. They developed infrastructure in these countries in ways the imperialists just don't do. Added to that, the fact that the Russian interventions in areas like the Sahel countries are also slowly turning the tide on the Al Qaeda men that the imperialists have employed to try and destabilize these nations. All of this is leading to a greater and greater crisis, and all of this means that the imperialists are going to get ever more hostile and hysterical towards the Chinese and the Russians. You see, the business model that's run since the 60s has depended upon the ability to ruthlessly exploit neo-colonial nations. It's the neo-colonial nations, with the aid of, but not to be dependent upon, the emergent non-imperialist powers like Russia, China, and to a lesser extent Iran. Then all you're going to get is more and more hysteria and attempts at aggression. from the imperial core nations. Now, there is this illusion that goes around, and you find this particularly amongst like pro-US comprador types in Ukraine or Armenia or somewhere like that, that there is still the capacity for the US to flick a switch, that the US can flick a switch and vastly open up its industrial capacity, outproduce the Russians in terms of war material, and really mobilize its forces, and then the Russians will be obliged to back down. This is a absolutely insane delusion based on a myth that has been propagated by the Anglo-Americans themselves, that they are capable of re-establishing their industrial bases if they just move a finger in that direction. It will happen. Now, some of the politicians in the imperial core nations genuinely do believe this. They genuinely do believe that all they need to do is snap an order, and, you know, as Captain Picard used to say, make it so, you know, and nothing happens. Now, this was the Biden administration. It's also the first Trump administration. It's like, well, we've done tariffs, we've thrown, you know, stimulus packages at them, we've flooded the capitalists with subsidies, and strangely, nothing's happening. Strangely, we're still being outproduced by, well, everybody, by the Chinese and the Russians. We haven't got an industrial base. What can we do? Because it's very hard to re-establish an industrial base when the entire way that capital has been moving for the last 100+ years is to be exported from the imperial core nations and to go into production elsewhere. It's why the US can't fully onshore its military production capacity. It can't fully reshore, I should say, its ability to produce fighter jets, produce helicopters, etc., because it's established a global supply chain, or its military industrial complex has established a global supply chain of resources and bases of production that it can't just get rid of. And so the politicians like Trump, Starmer too, to an extent, Macron too, are completely delusional. They don't understand their own system, because if they understood their own system, they would know that you can't just reverse capital flows by passing a law. Capital requires profit. Profit requires, under the capitalist system, the exploitation of human labor, and to attain the sufficient level of profit that would justify employing human labor in manufacturing inside the imperial core nations, you would need to, again, reduce the cost of that labor down as far as you possibly could. And you can't do that without a struggle. And so, whether there is a struggle going on, there is an attempt to grind down the working class still. But what you have is is a system which is getting more and more stuck. And again, this is what the so-called realists who say that there is no need for the United States to fight Russia, there's no US interest there, they're completely wrong. That's why they don't understand the nature of their own system. There's every need for the US to seek the collapse of Russia, because the only way that this system, this rotten parasitic system, is going to be able to revive itself is by feasting on the bones, or the meat and the bones of the big non-imperialist nations like Russia, like China, like Iran. And so you will only get ceaseless aggression, as I've said many times before, because the system is in such a gigantic crisis. So let's get back to the question of controlled demolition. But to answer Holger Ritter's question first, that's the starry plough of the Irish. It was used by, I believe, the Irish Citizen Army of James Connolly back in the period leading up to the Easter Rising of 1916, about which, by the way, about Irish history, more to come in future episodes. So, to return to the question of, is this a controlled demolition? What we're witnessing is not a controlled demolition. What we're witnessing is all of these contradictions playing out. But you see, what you have in these periods of decay is that the intellectual and the political capacities of the ruling class have also decayed. So you have people nominally in charge of these systems who clearly have no idea how they work. This is true in every declining and falling system, without wanting to well, actually, with a degree of plugging for our own show. What you have is elites that emerge, like political elites from the ruling class, or who act for the ruling class, who are completely and utterly divorced from reality, and who think that they can still govern in the old way. I mean, to use Lenin's phrase, one of the definitions of a revolutionary situation is that the ruling group can no longer continue to rule in the old way, but many of them still think that they can, and attempt to re-establish the old way, but end up only exacerbating the crisis, which is a key factor to understand here. You see, you have a perfect example of the ruling class thinking it can proceed in the old way, with the war strategy against the Russians, which is that they thought they could proceed in the way that they had gone through with other countries, which is create an internal crisis, pile on sanctions, activate your internal agents inside a country, and then you would succeed at regime change. And then when this didn't work, they had no other move to make. They couldn't do it. They still have no other move to make. For all Trump's honking and bellowing and ranting and raving about deploying nuclear submarines, and I'm not going to take that off that Medvedev guy. You know, Trump gets mad and starts trying to deploy nuclear submarines to new locations in the world because someone out trolled him on Twitter. It's very funny. But to go back to the point, what looks like to people who are far gone on Western supremacism and chauvinism, people who, even if they've reached the point where they've started to question the ability of the West to continue, they still have a fundamental belief on some level that all the West needs to do is to find the right leadership, and they can turn it all around. And the problem is that the leaders are stupid, but they don't understand why the leaders are stupid. Why is it that the leaders of Britain have degenerated to the point where we've had Keir Starmer, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, Theresa May, 5 leaders in just over 6 years from 2 different parties? If you go back 10 years, we've had, you add in Cameron as well, that's 7 leaders inside a decade. That's quite something. That's that each prime minister barely lasts like a year and a bit, which again is unprecedented for like Britain, which used to pride itself, the British ruling class used to pride itself on a degree of political stability. It no longer has access to that because everything's decayed, because the automatic process that exists inside the British government now is that the British government exists to facilitate the transfer of capital overseas and the despoilation of other countries. That's what it exists to do. Inside the country, all it exists to do is to facilitate the devouring of different elements of the country by parasitic capital, and to assist with that in whatever way the state can. And so you just have a system of pure parasitism that is unable to adapt, because there's too many different elements to the system that are, or too many different elements in the ruling class that are still doing well enough from a completely parasitic system to block and oppose any kind of change. This, by the way, is the fate of St. Jeremy of Corbyn, St. Jeremy of Islington, which is that he didn't want to overthrow capitalism. He didn't want to overthrow British imperialism, but he wanted his mild reforms were opposed intensely, because had they been carried through, even the mild ones he wanted, it would have provoked a crisis in the system. So, of course, St. Jeremy, being the saintly, godly man he is, merely capitulated and fell over. So, to come back to the question, the West is not undergoing a controlled demolition. What we are seeing in the West is the logical conclusion of imperialism, which is massive capital export, deindustrialization, loss of advantages in terms of scientific and technological innovation and capacity, inability to actually re-establish the industrial production base that the science and tech base grows out of, inability to change or reignite the dynamism in the political system, complete and total corruption reigning all around, and every move that the rulers make that to try and solve these problems only exacerbates them. This is what happens towards the end of every period. And whereas in the imperial coronations, this isn't controlled demolition, but it can look like it if you're not aware of the contradictions that are in play. So I'll leave the comments there, and then we will catch up with those who are in the chat. Right. So who have we got with us tonight? Slumbering Colossus from the belly of the beast. Daniel, Comrade Daniel, joining us from Somerset. Enigma, joining us from Northeast Albion. Northeast Perfidious Albion, I should say. Hello to Molotov Cocktail. Hello to Marius. Hello to Bertram Clement. Hello to YepX. Marius says these theories are the last resort of Western chauvinists. They can't accept the Western bourgeoisie could actually be outmaneuvered and outsmarted by inferior Asian adversaries. Well, that's certainly part of it. Hello to Matt Vollmer. Hello to Thomas Wolfe, who's joining us from Oklahoma. I watched a very interesting documentary on the Oklahoma City bombing the other day. More on that in future episodes. Hello to the Wicked Witch of the Southeast. Hello to Rocinante 3003, who celebrates the return of the regular football season, League 1 and 2. Well, I'm not celebrating because the club I support, Sheffield Wednesday, seems to be about to go out of business. I'm going to be working on an article about that pretty soon. But I'll just say, confine my comments on sport here to saying this, which is, it is better now if your football club is in the amount of debt and disaster that mine is in, and you're talking football in the European sense, not football in the American sense. But if your football club is in this kind of disastrous debt, better to go bankrupt. Better to go bankrupt, be put out of business, than resurrect the name as a fan-owned operation in the lower leagues. It's better to do that than to have a club which is just sunk permanently in debt, unable to get out of it, and he's just basically the plaything of various different shady businessmen who have no interest really in reviving it. It is better to go bankrupt. It is better to start with, like, a few hundred people watching the game on a Saturday around like a park. That's better. That's better than this. I mean, I'll be doing a football show with the comrades from the Class Consciousness Project pretty soon. So we'll return to this subject then. But my view on this is it is better to go to be rendered out of business and have to start all over again in the lowest league than try to struggle on carrying around this colossal amount of debt. Better to do that and start out as a democratic fan-owned operation than suffer through years of degradation and humiliation at the hands of various shady owners. Anyway, moving on. Hello to Victor. Hello to James Goblin on X, Gonzalo Cabrera, and Yuan from Phoenix, Arizona. And who else we got? We got Raise the Red Banner from New Zealand. Good morning to you who are comrades already in tomorrow. Hello to Rob and Beans down there in Yorkshire. Hello to Alistair Page McGill, John Crowfeather, Edward joining us from Latvia, Jasmine Wolf. Hello to you, Aid, Davey on the road home from Liverpool. We've got Jerry and Victor, another Victor, Ugbo Daga, Lisa P, Adingo 80 Baby over on Rumble. Daniel says, reminds me of the P&O ferry scandal when they were going to replace their workers with the cheaper Indian labor. People like my mum were horrified, but I told them that this is how capitalism operates. Yes, indeed, that's exactly how capitalism operates. I mean, especially in the in the when it comes to shipping, when it comes to like ferries and shipping, not just in terms of passenger ships, but also in terms of cargo ships. They've always gone for like the lowest waged workers possible. I mean, it's why so many cargo ships are registered to Panama or Liberia, because you want to be able to get away with paying as little as possible. And so what P&O Ferries did a few years ago, which is an old British company, firing all their British staff, bringing in like cheaper Indian sailors. Well, that's standard operating procedure, has been for decades. If you're horrified about that, well, yeah, you should be, but then the only way that's going to be reversed is if we end British imperialism. So if that horrifies you, then you know what to do. Hello to Zain Mudassir. Nemo Yederman says, isn't the overproduction of elites also a cause of instability? I mean, that is the old Christopher Lash thing. We need to be precise about what we mean by elites. So, like, what do we mean by elites under capitalism? So, I would identify an elite under capitalism as being a group that is that are well remunerated servants of the ruling class. So, elite, there is like artistic elite, media elites, political elites, state elites. That pretty much crosses over with state and politics. But political elite would be like the most of the members of like the chambers of the British Parliament, House of Lords, House of Commons. Connected to that is like the state elite, which is like the senior level functionaries of the British civil service, all of whom have direct connections with the ruling class and with various different other ruling class institutions. So that elite should mean like really that level, those who have have their hands on certain levers of power, which are exercise on behalf of the ruling class, whose position really is paid for and is largely dependent upon the ruling class. So are we overproducing them? There is an argument to say that, like in Britain especially, that is true. There is an overproduction of like senior management layers, senior consultant layers, which is a product of the advanced state of decay than in Britain. I mean, you want to look at overproduction of elites, look at the fact that the British Navy has more admirals than ships. So in the case of that is very much overproduction of elite roles. I would say it's a symptom of imperial decline, but it's not the cause. So let's see. Richard V from Las Vegas has joined us, and we've got 402 of you watching now. Good stuff. Be sure to keep liking and sharing the stream. Jonathan Foster, J.R. Shield, Albert, Holistic Politics is with us. Caustic Grip, who says a couple of years ago they opened a driverless bus route in Estonia. My mother took it once and said it was the most frightening thing she ever experienced. Probably is. Who else we got here? Yep, X, Aid, Holger Ritter. What do I think of the Banshees of Inisherin? I liked it when I saw it, when it first came out. I'm going to rewatch it pretty soon, so I may end up doing a review on it. Hello to DJ Darkside. Alistair Page McGill says, but Jeremy Corbyn promised to campaign on green energy and fighting the far right. Well, wait until St. Jeremy goes into coalition with what's left of the Labour Party. There we go. Caustic Grip says, funny how a guy twice Medvedev's height gets offended at his tweets. Trump's ego is truly the most fragile thing in the world. A normal person would have just called Medvedev and Shorty and be done with it. Yeah, well, Trump can't let it go. It betrays a deep-seated fear that he's lost the war and can't do anything about it. Id Mansour Fauzi said, We are seeing the demolition of the living standards of the petit bourgeoisie and lower middle class. US empire still has control over commercial maritime fluxes and financial supremacy. To a degree, yes, that will go, though, in time. In fact, it already is going. Hello to Matt Parker, Robert Zvorinich, Chris Thomas Conway, coming to us from the Great Salt Lake. Olafson, hello. Alan from Oakland, hello to you. Exodus joins us from The Hague in the Netherlands. We got Jonas Levinson and also Ash and Nat, who says, I'd love to hear Alexander's take on Habib's advanced UK now that Tommy Robinson has so publicly joined them. I sense the state backing a fascist horse here for when Reformer act. Well, I haven't researched advanced UK indeed as much as I would like as yet. There's all kinds of fascist forces out there that the state kind of maintains. They maintained Robinson for a little while. Often he's gone into exile again now. He's run away and he's begging for money online. The actor known as the actor known as Tommy Robinson is, of course, in reality, a man named Stephen Yaxley Lennon, who's way more posh than he likes to think, and he likes people to think he is. So I'm going to have to look more at advanced UK. The British state's always kept a variety of fascistic forces at its disposal, though. They like to keep them on hand for if things escalate, they can dramatically ramp them up, not just for reasons of using them as essentially paramilitary thugs, so that would be their primary usage, but also, like, as we've seen recently, like, you throw in another sort of fascistic organization into the mix and get them to do, say, something like demonstrations outside of migrant hotels, which is a reactionary and a racist fucking thing to do. Let's be absolutely clear about this. What you generate, though, in terms of a response from the so-called organized left, is a response where they'll go and do a counter demonstration and the two sides will yell at each other and nothing. And the question of, like, well, why are people stashed in hotels won't be asked. And this is one of the usages of these fascist guys who can just be activated, make a big noise. Left responds to them essentially by echoing bourgeois messaging about an anti-racism, which is divorced from material conditions and is just about basically aesthetics and bad language and language policing. And that's what anti-fascism amounts to in the imperialist countries today. Molotov Cocktail correctly points out that Yaxley Lennon literally named himself after a football hooligan in Luton. Yeah, he stole the name from somebody else. He's a state agent playing a character, fundamentally. Id Mansour Fauzi says, this vague doomster narrative of demolition of the West is quite popular now in right-wing circles. Yeah, it has been for years, especially with Emmanuel Todd has done a European tour for his book, Défait de l'Occident. Yeah, I mean, they sell like Emmanuel Todd as like this guy who predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. Now he's predicting the fall of the West. What they fail to realize is that you're dealing with two fundamentally different systems. And whilst there are comparisons to be made, they're not the comparisons that like bourgeois academics think they are. You see, what you got in the Soviet Union, the more you study it, the more you come to the conclusion that yes, that was a deliberate demolition. They did everything they possibly could to ensure that the system fell apart. Gorbachev, whether he was really the one making the decisions or was the front man, certainly like the bourgeois elements, particularly in like Russia, Ukraine and other places, did everything they could to ensure that all of the centrifugal forces which kept the Soviet Union unified were destroyed. And the people who did that knew very well what they were doing and knew very well what the outcome was that they wanted. And it's the outcome that they got. The bourgeois aren't doing that. They're trying to restabilize their system, but they can't do it because the system has too many contradictions, and to try to resolve any of them would be to pull at a string which would lead to an unraveling. Now, some would argue that's what happened in the Soviet Union, but that isn't true, because as we discussed when we looked at the Chinese documentary about the reasons for the fall of the USSR, and we did have that long discussion in that program about that. What was done in the Soviet Union was calculated, it was deliberate, and it was heavily influenced by the imperialist powers themselves, who were paying Gorbachev quite a lot of money way before the final collapse. And so in that case, we can demonstrate quite clearly that decisions were taken with the idea being in mind that they were actively working towards a collapse. The imperialists now aren't actively working towards a collapse. It's just that they've got themselves into a situation which can't be resolved. The late stage Soviet Union did face problems, but it was not the case that this was a situation which could not be resolved. There were resolutions were available without taking an axe to the CPSU, without destroying, without deliberately cultivating petty separatist nationalist forces in the different constituent republics, without turning the entire press over to reactionaries to deliberately attack and erode support for the Soviet system. The bourgeoisie is not doing any of that in their own countries. They're very careful to keep their hands on the tillers when it comes to the propaganda system. But they are making decisions which exacerbate their situation because they can't face the giant structural problems that they do have inside the system. Hello to all three of you watching on Rumble. It is on there. Free Palestine says Roger Casement was hanged at Pentonville Jail, 3rd of August 1916, RIP. Indeed. Aid says, I work as an executive assistant for a tech company, and executives, and indeed they just multiply. Yeah, indeed they do. President Jesus asks, how do we ensure that criticism of British imperialism doesn't lead to renewed interest in LaRoucheism? LaRoucheism is a bastardization of Marxism, and LaRouche himself, being a Trotskyite, collapsed into completely non-dialectical conspiracist modes of thought. He took what was an essential truth, which is that there was that the role of British imperialism had been underplayed including by the British imperialists themselves, and that they sought to get a foothold inside the USA in order to get the US imperialists to act as their muscle. That is true, and that the British imperialists changed the way they did business after Suez, in particular, in 1956, to ensure that their form of neo-colonialism they practiced could still be practiced, albeit with the muscle behind them of the US, but again, working through more subtle methods than that which they used to have. So there is an essential truth to the idea that the role of British imperialism is much more important than it has been historically acknowledged as being by the entire left in the West since the 1940s. Now, what, again, LaRouche does with that, in the manner of an opportunist, which is what he was, which is he takes that truth and turns it into a worldview, turns it into a very, completely one-sided, non-dialectical view of things, which is that the British royal family is, running the US and runs all global drug rackets. Now, again, certain amount of truth in that the British ruling class is some of the biggest drug dealers in the world, historically and currently, but it's a title that they share with the US. See, what LaRouche's mistake, and it was probably quite a deliberate mistake, was to completely underplay the actual power and dominant role of US imperialism. Yes, British imperialism's role has been underplayed, a strategy the British imperialists themselves are quite happy with. But it doesn't mean that they are secretly running the US. They contend for influence over the US, certainly. But again, LaRouche was non-dialectical and far too crude and simplistic in his analysis, which is why he ended up leading a cult. Now, there's, as Marius points out in the chat, they are also strange in that they're also very economistic, meaning that they have taken a completely one-sided vision of like the need for the development of the productive forces, which is why like certain LaRoucheites ended up like being like pro-China and something, because they see China as the ultimate like developer of the productive forces now. So like LaRouche ended up like completely underplaying and in fact writing off class struggle entirely, because fundamentally the guiding principle behind LaRouche himself, first of all, was Trotskyism, but also a particularly crude form of Marxism that was very narrow, very economistic, and very what I would call overly productivist and non-dialectical, which is why he ends up doing what he did. Interesting character, completely bizarre, but I would say that the focus on like LaRouche and his cult neglects the fact that the rest of the American left isn't much better, historically speaking, or currently. Like, they're not much better than the LaRouche cult. In fact, in some ways, they might even be worse. I mean, the LaRouche cult can be accused quite rightly of like having a narrow productivist understanding of things, but the likes of the PSL and others are completely fucking focused on idealism. So like, whereas you could say that the LaRoucheites are like narrowly focused on like industrial and economic development, completely neglecting, in fact, writing off like the class analysis of society. Their opponents on the American left completely neglect all of that. And also the other thing about that the LaRoucheites and the American left have in common is that they all write off most forms of actually existing socialism. Other than now, like the LaRoucheites are into China, as I said earlier, for reasons that I've already gone into. They see China as the ultimate development of like the productive forces. So, like for all that I have no time really for the LaRoucheites, they're no worse than the PSL. Both are fundamentally like they are examples of like the imperial compatible left that is created in the laboratories of like the US intelligence services. Kevin Chewy says USA fake left, the predominant, are worse than LaRouche, and if you don't know that, you don't know anything. I suspect we've got a LaRouche fan in the chat. Yeah, your guy was the creation of a fucking intelligence operation, so, and was a fucking bankrupt Trotskyite hack. So do calm down and do go away. You're as bad as the PSL. Right, moving on. Okay, so well, if Marius, I would have responded to you by saying if LaRouche types are the only Marxist group championing the Belt and Road Initiative, that's a good way for the US ruling class to shitcoat the Belt and Road Initiative. Anything those people attach themselves to is easily demonized because of all the other stupid shit that these people put out there. So be very suspicious of them, just as you should be very suspicious of the likes of the PSL, etc. The actually existing left, all of its organizations need to face the fact that it's all crap, all of it, and it can only be critiqued and demolished. It can't be redeemed. And yes, some people in there might be sincere. Many of us were. But until you realize that the organizations that you are in are fundamentally garbage and are irredeemably garbage, for all the reasons we've gone into before, then you're going to be left with nothing. There will be nothing to work around. There will be nothing to organize around. And again, the only thing we can do with these things is consign them to the dustbin of history. Okay, so looking through some more comments here. Always fun when the LaRouche stuff comes up. Songs 4K says the LaRouche paranoid patriotic fever dreams. Indeed, indeed. Sid says the LaRouche answer during the 2000s the Bush administration was let's impeach Cheney and reinstitute the New Deal. Yeah, because it was the only problem with the Bush administration was Dick Cheney. I mean, to believe that, you'd have to have drilled it. You have to do home brain surgery involving putting a power drill through your fucking head. Seriously. Okay. So moving back to the question of like controlled demolitions, etc. I'll bring my comments on this to a close for tonight, which is that to actually understand why the West is declining, you must have like an understanding of like the development of capitalism into imperialism and the degeneration of imperialism, and why that takes a long time, and why the decline of any system takes a long time. And what we see manifesting in front of us now has been in the works for decades and decades. It's just that we are fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending upon your point of view, to see this now play out. And the decline and fall, again, to plug my own show title, is an interesting and confusing thing to behold. And only through studying Marx, Engels, Lenin in particular, but also Stalin and Mao, can we actually get to the point when we can not only understand this decay and collapse, but also prepare ourselves to organize for the overcoming of this system. So we will bring things to a conclusion for tonight. Thanks to all 443 of you watching. And tomorrow night, we'll be back with another episode of What Does a Revolution Look Like? So be sure to join me for that one. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you to all of those of you who support the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again soon. And now, here's your outro.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, веют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.